Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. Are this week's Remembrance Day events a legitimate honouring of the dead or a brazen attempt to justify war? David Cameron's pledge to turn the forthcoming anniversary of World War I into a national celebration has given these questions renewed significance during this year's Poppy Day appeal. Opinion in the Muslim community is as divided as elsewhere. So before we discuss this controversy, let's take a look at Emily Churchill's report from the British Armed Forces Muslim Association Eid dinner.
Yesterday, for 2 minutes, people around the world fell silent to remember the soldiers who've died at war over the past 100 years. Remembrance Day, on the 11th of November, commemorates the moment the First World War finally came to an end. What is perhaps not always remembered is that many of those killed serving the British Army were Muslim. More than 3.5 million soldiers from the Asian subcontinent fought for the British during both World Wars, many of them Muslims. Today, Muslims are hugely underrepresented in the British Armed Forces, and it's safe to bet that many are put off by Britain's recent military ventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the British Armed Forces Muslim Association believes there's no contradiction between serving in the UK military and following Islam. At their Eid dinner earlier this month, the organisation's patron, Chief of Defence Staff Sir David Richards, showed his support for Muslim servicemen and women.
Muslim values are, as I just hinted, military values. Community before self, integrity, loyalty, honour. These are things that I associate, and I hope all of you do, not only with Islam, quite rightly, but also with what we in the armed forces take pride in. With my heart, I am, if you like, a Muslim, because, and I think all of the best people in the armed forces, and I think most people in the armed forces are outstanding, are natural Muslims in many respects, because we share so many values.
One of those listening in agreement was Major Sher Aslam, an eye surgeon who's worked for the armed forces for nearly 17 years, including in Bosnia and Iraq.
Certainly, from the faith point of view, there are differences, but that's not something that's incompatible. That's something that's completely compatible. And in fact, some of the attributes that are part of the forces are exactly the same attributes that are required of someone who's practicing as a Muslim.
The British Muslims here may be a small minority, but their message is as clear as it will be, for many, controversial. That Muslims can serve in the British Army with a clear conscience. Emily Churchill, Islam Channel.
Well, with me to discuss the politics of Remembrance Day and the participation of Muslims in the military are freelance journalist Asad Beg, who recently wrote an article, Why I Choose Not to Wear a Poppy, for the Huffington Post, Mohammed Amin, Vice Chair of the Conservative Muslim Forum, and Jahan Mahmood, military historian and author of Britain's Muslim Soldiers. Joining us on the phone is Captain Naveed Mohammed, second in command of the Armed Forces Careers Office in Birmingham and Deputy Chair of the British Armed Forces Muslim Association. Welcome to the programme, all of you. Asad, first of all, what was the point of the article that you wrote? What issues were you trying to raise?
I think the issues I'm trying to raise here is that, look, the poppy isn't a symbol of peace. It's not a symbol of remembrance. It's not a symbol to say no more wars. It's become a nationalistic and patriotic symbol that if everyone on TV is expected to wear one, you know, black and Asian people are expected to wear extra big ones to show their loyalty to the British state. And at a time when Britain not only has bombed and occupied Iraq, is also occupying and bombing Afghanistan. I think that if the poppy was to be taken seriously, they wouldn't engage in any new wars. They wouldn't be bombing children. They wouldn't be occupying other countries. And if you look at the First World War, it was the war to end all wars. Why the Second World War? And if you look at many of the problems that we have today, they originate and they stem from the First World War. So, you know, if you really want to remember the dead, if you want to honour them and respect them, it's very, very simple. Stop engaging in new wars.
Mohammed, isn't that a fair point? You know, when we remember the Holocaust, the message on Holocaust Remembrance Day is never again. But the message on Remembrance Day isn't never again. There's an element of it which many people see as justifying future killing. So there is a problem here, isn't there?
No, I completely disagree with you. First of all, I'm personally a member of the Royal British Legion, because you don't have to be an ex-serviceman to join the Royal British Legion. You just have to care about our wounded ex-servicemen. The poppy is a symbol of remembrance for those who died, and also the need to take care of those who survived, because for every person killed in a war, there are many casualties who will suffer for the rest of their lives from their injuries, and I think they need all the help and support we can give them. Choosing to buy a poppy has got nothing to do with militarism. The question of whether to engage in any particular war or not engage in that war is something we can discuss on a case-by-case basis. But wearing a poppy is not a militaristic symbol, it's a symbol of recognition and remembrance.
What do you think about that, David?
Well, I have my concerns about what it represents today. In the past, we've understood it to mean the sacrifices made by servicemen, Commonwealth and Imperial, World War I and II mainly, but more World War I. Over the last few years, I feel that it has been hijacked by politicians. I remember an article in 2009, which was more again chastising David Cameron and Brown about the way they handled a particular photo opportunity, and it was a gaffe because it was marking the end of the first generation of the World War I, and they were both reprimanded for the opportunity they took as personal gain, political gain. And that's a concern for me. I think if people are remembering the sacrifices made, then it's not an issue. But if it's going to be hijacked by politicians, then it's a serious concern.
Let me bring in Naveed. In the introductory film there was a suggestion that the recruitment to the armed forces has been affected, or the Muslim recruitment to the armed forces has been affected by the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Is that the case?
I would disagree with that. There are many factors which affect recruiting. You know, we're going through a restructuring program at the moment. We're looking at where we need to fill vacancies, and we're putting suitably qualified people into those vacancies. So that in itself could have an impact on figures, if you like, because we don't specifically go out and say we only want to recruit people of a particular background. You know, the army is open to everyone, and we encourage everyone to apply to join the army.
So why do you think it is that that there's such a discrepancy between the proportion of Muslims in the armed forces and in the general population?
Well, I think the key thing to remember is that this discrepancy isn't new. It's existed for some time. Yes, clearly, you know, the recent operations in the ongoing operation in Afghanistan and the one before that in Iraq may have an impact on people's mindset as to whether they wish to pursue a career in the army. But that's a decision for an individual to make and to decide whether they wish to become part of an organization with which they will be expected to serve in places where you know, places such as Iraq and Afghanistan.
I mean, what do you think about this historically, about the participation of Muslims in the armed forces? Do you get the sense that there is a greater problem now than perhaps in the past?
Yeah, definitely. Well, partly because we are operating in Muslim countries, and many Muslims do see the British Armed Forces as the sword arm of British foreign policy, and that's certainly something that's also radicalised a lot of young Muslims. The difference in British India, of course, was that it was not united. There was no real sense of a national state, no nationality in that sense. People were much more compartmentalised, and the heads of a lot of clans had personal alliances that had been built with British administrators against the Sikhs, for instance, in 1848, where they decided to side with the British against the Sikh empire in the Punjab. And that really started off a relationship. And after that, they were allowed their own autonomy as long as they provided cannon fodder to Britain's colonial army. So there's very much a difference in India at the time and what continued to be the British Indian Army. And the difference today is that people here have enough money to live, to get by. In that part of the world, sometimes it was very difficult. People gave up other occupations that weren't doing very well to join the army.
Mohammed, do you think that that the Poppy Day appeal will be more politicised. You're saying that you don't think it is, but do you think that there's a danger that it will become so, even from your point of view, when David Cameron is talking about turning 2014 into a national celebration of the First World War? I mean, surely this is, of all the wars, it's commonly seen to be the most wasteful and destructive ever. Do you think this is a suitable case for national commemoration?
Well, first of all, as I said before, I don't believe that the Poppy appeal is politicised at all today. Now, coming on to the commemoration of the First World War. The First World War was an amazingly important historical event. It was by far and away the most important thing to happen in Europe since the Napoleonic Wars. And it transformed the face of Europe in many, many ways for the worse, unfortunately. It gave birth eventually to Nazi Germany and more immediately to the Soviet Union, both of which were disasters for humanity. But we have to remember our past, unpleasant though it may be. And I think it is right to remember the First World War, right to remember the suffering and devastation that it caused. And you can't fail to commemorate an event of that significance.
It's less about historical memory, though. I mean, I think we all agree that, of course, these are significant events, and it's right to understand their historical context and their meaning. I think the problem comes when the element of celebration enters into it. That this is something that we should remember positively.
No,
do you think that's right?
I just want to come back on a few points. Mohammed Amin said he was a part of the Royal British Legion and, supporting our troops and our wounded. I don't see them as our wounded, but how about the wounded in Afghanistan and Iraq, the casualties on that side, or the civilian casualties? Far outnumber the casualties on the British side or the Western side, and they don't have the support of the state, and they don't have the support of charities. And the bottom line is, it's the government's responsibility to help the war wounded, not rely on charity. And as for Naveed, Captain Naveed, he seems to be in denial about whether that's a problem in recruitment. I did a piece for the BBC, and every single person I went to in the Muslim community across Birmingham, not a single youngster said that they would join the British military simply because they are waging unjust wars in Muslim lands. So there's a problem in recruitment. And I think there's a denial here that the poppy isn't politicized. When David Cameron is off in the Middle East selling arms to dictators and manages to get back just in time to commemorate the war dead, I think that's an insult and a huge disrespect. And this is the same man who's trying to turn this into a nationalistic event when he's selling arms, weapons of war that kill and maim to dictators in the Middle East. I think it just reeks of hypocrisy.
Mohammed, were you concerned that there's an element of hypocrisy about this when it was revealed by the Sunday Times that the head of the British Legion was using Remembrance Day to try and have contacts with the Prime Minister and the Defence Ministry about contracts? That's to diminish anything that we might properly regard as the subject of Remembrance Day.
Lobbying by ex-generals to try to get contracts for the companies that they may be representing is something that I think is reprehensible, especially if they're actually breaching the terms of their severance arrangements, because they have to have a 2-year cooling off period. But I want to come back to something much more significant, which is what Asad Beg said a moment ago. And I find it completely shocking that somebody who was a British citizen, born in this country, is unable to say our when referring to wounded British service people. If the word our doesn't relate to them, what do you regard as the word our?
When you say our, these people, these soldiers, have been sent under orders of politicians. And I have a feeling for these soldiers and their families when they're injured or killed. And you can't deny the pain and suffering their families go to. But I don't see the same concern coming from you when it concerns Afghans or Iraqis or Palestinians or anyone else in the world that doesn't seem to be British. I did not send those soldiers out to war. If politicians or Tory leaders want to go to war, how about they send their own children out? But instead the children are in private schools in Eton or Westminster, and they send working class children out to face the bullets of the resistance in those countries. when they have cushy lives for their own children here. And I think it's just hypocritical. So no, they're not they're not waging a war in my name or in my defense or even in the defense of Britain. Yes, this is my country. However, the foreign policy is not one that I agree with or have endorsed.
The grandson of the Queen is out there putting his life on the line right now.
Let me just bring Naveed in. Do you think that the government is fighting a losing battle in terms of trying to kind of re-establish this as a central part of national life? Because when you read the historical accounts of the first Remembrance Day, the entire capital of London stopped. The trams came to a halt, the buses came to a halt in 1919 when it was first established. The government is never going to get us back to that point. The sensibilities aren't the same, are they?
No, they're certainly not. I think the modern day war, people are tired of it. I really genuinely believe that the British public is tired and sick of wars. Many people that I speak to on the streets, wherever I go, I often have this discussion with them. Be it the Iraq War or even in Afghanistan. We've been in Afghanistan for as long as World War I and II combined now. But what have we really achieved? The thing is, at the end of World War I, there was still some kind of achievement. There is army fighting army, there is a surrender. And people are looking back with loss and remembrance, of course. But I think that we seem to be making mistake after mistake. And that's the difference here, is that the Iraq War was a complete blunder. I've met many soldiers who were against it themselves. We don't get to hear some of their voices. But I'm afraid politicians decide where soldiers go. Soldiers don't decide where they go.
Let me come back to Naveed. Naveed, I understand completely that you're unable, obviously, to express an opinion about the foreign policy of the country or the wars that they're engaged in. But is there a sense from the people that you're talking to and trying to recruit that mood that Naveed has just talked about is now part of what you have to deal with in the way that perhaps it wasn't 10 or 15 years ago, or wouldn't have been if you were been involved in it then?
Yeah, of course. Let me just go back to the point made about me being in denial. You know, if anything, I fully appreciate the challenges that some people may perceive about pursuing a career in the army, especially amongst the Muslim community, and you know, that's a fact that I deal with on an almost daily basis. However, there are also many more people who do say to me, you know, that once things are settled down, perhaps once we move on, you know, perhaps I will encourage my son or daughter to pursue a career in the military. You know, so there is that positive side to it as well. Sorry, just repeat your question again, please.
I was just saying that in your work, I'm not asking you to comment on the rights or wrongs of it, but are you aware of the impact of that kind of that Jahan was talking about there, about the change in mood in the society around you?
Absolutely. There's no, as I said, there's no doubt about that at all. But the one thing we do is we have a policy of education. You know, we sell the offer, if you like. We talk about what you can get out of being you know, being in the army. It's not all about frontline roles. You know, out of 142 odd different jobs, 20% of the army is frontline, if you like. So the combat roles, the infantry, the armored corps, etc. But then you've got the 80%, which is in a supporting role. And these are all jobs where you can pick up skills and qualifications which perhaps you may not be able to gain in civilian life, and have a better life for yourself afterwards.
Mohammed, let me just ask you a more general question about this, because David Cameron made a speech at the beginning of the year in which he said, look, it's going to be a tough year economically, very difficult year for us economically, but don't worry, we've got the Jubilee and we've got the Olympics, and these will be, you know, fantastically good for Britain. Now, whatever you think about that, I mean, you know, many people said, all right, this is, you know, it's bread and circus, except there isn't any bread. But it's one thing to say this about the Jubilee. It's one thing to say it about the Olympics. Yeah. Surely it's not an appropriate thing, and this seems to be where he's going with the celebration of World War I. It's not an appropriate thing to do with an event like World War I.
I don't think it is where he's going. My understanding of David Cameron's position is very simple, that World War I was an incredibly important historical event. All around our country, there are gravestones, there are commemorations. The organ at my school, the grammar school that I went to, had the names of former pupils of Central Grammar School that had died in World War I. At Clare College, we have many Clare alumni who died in World War I. We are remembering them, and it is 100 years since that war started in 1914. That is what we're remembering.
Jahan, do you think that the Muslim contribution in the past has been properly remembered in the way that Mohammed describes the general remembrance?
No, I don't think it has. I think that the importance of the British Indian Army has been largely left out. Muslims fought not just from South Asia or the Indian subcontinent, but they also fought from Africa and the Middle East and much further afield. There were also some mistakes made by the speaker on the show earlier on. From India alone, we had 4 million volunteers, and about 1 million plus were Muslim. So the Hindus, being the largest majority there, obviously represented, or largely represented in the army. But I don't think it's remembered properly, no, because I think that Britain after the war did a lot to remember its own soldiers. There wasn't many South Asian communities at the time, but I think that we've been playing catch-up ever since. It's a great shame that people like myself, something like 60-odd years afterwards, are writing about this particular history. I would like for it to have been in the mainstream much earlier on. I think that we would have been able to build relationships which we've not been able to build, and under the situation where there is a rise in Islamophobia, is that we're up against the tide. And the more you talk about Muslim soldiers, the more I get accused of just isolating the Muslims. So it's left me in a very precarious situation.
I mean, Asad, do you think if there had been a more accurate remembrance of the past, it would have made current wars more difficult to sustain? Because in a way, you're going to be carrying out a war involving the descendants of the people who fought with you in the last war.
I don't think so. I think that, keep in mind that the same people in Afghanistan, for example, were called the Mujahideen. Margaret Thatcher, who Muhammad Amin loves, was said our Mujahideen. And now these are the same people you're fighting against and calling terrorists. And going back to the point by Muhammad Amin, he said, look, we sell the role and we tell them about the education and stuff. And this is the exact misconceptions about the army we need to get rid of. That we tell working class kids that should have a free education, and thanks to the government they don't, that you can get an education, just join the military. And they find themselves in Afghanistan outgunned by the Afghan resistance. They're technically better than the British, and the majority of the Afghans don't want a foreign force in their country. So what we're essentially doing to people is lying to them. And the adverts on TV say, oh, join the British military, you go on holiday, have fun, and it looks great on your CV. No one tells them about Afghanistan. No one tells them how difficult it is. No one tells them that every day they are under attack by a resistance that just does not want them there and has the support of the population there. So no, I don't think it would make it better, because the state and the elites in this country will use Muslims, just like the colonialists in India and wherever they went, use some natives as a propaganda tool, and they were just the tools of the colonialists. And we see many of them today.
Okay. Naveed, let me bring you back in on that and ask you one additional question. Do you think that you can recruit very young people to the army? I mean, before they can drive a car, they can't go to combat, but they can be recruited to the army. Do you think that they can make the kind of judgments that you're talking about, or that Asad's talking about, properly at that age?
Well, before somebody under the age of 18 decides to join the army, they must have the consent of their parent or their guardian. So that's the first thing, So the selling the offer, about a career in the military is one thing. Making that decision to follow through with that is something where, if you're over the age of 18, legally you can make your own mind up. However, if you're under that age, then this is where your parents and your guardians come in.
Okay, well, Captain Naveed Mohammed from Birmingham, we're going to have to leave that as the last word on this part of the discussion, but do join us for the second part of the Politics and Media programme, when we'll be discussing whether or not the press should be regulated by law.